My first night out. I so hate going against Daddy's wishes. After all, I'm supposed to be the good daughter in the family. But what can I do? I'm 15 years old now and I haven't seen the outside world like my dear sister has. She's been going out alone forever and Daddy doesn't stop her. I know I'm his little girl, but I'm sure the world isn't like he tells me. I look at the entrance to this snazzy looking club with that huge neon sign that just beckons me to enter. Dear sister tells me I'm too young to enter these places, but the man outside takes one look at me and lets me in. I'm sure my dear sister will be fine with me borrowing her dress. It might be a little revealing, the plunging neckline and the hem barely reaching my thighs, but it did get me in, didn't it? In here everything goes by in a blur, men and women barely able to keep their hands off each other, women dancing in cages, drinks being poured at the bar. The moment I take a seat, a man swoops in, his eyes travel up and down my figure. He's dressed in a smart suit, his hair perfectly shaped with an edge to the spikes, and a breathtaking cologne that I can't miss. Daddy told me not to talk to men like these. He said whenever a man looks at my body more than my face, it's time to leave. But I've seen my dear sister with men like this before and they all turn out well. He speaks like such a gentleman, complimenting my hair, my smile, very delicately running a finger on the surface of my exposed leg. I don't know why Daddy was worried. I can't believe my night out is going so well. This man is such a sweetheart. He tells me he's a reporter who's cracked a lot of big-time stories involving murder, kidnapping, or sexual assaults. He tells me he can't say more or he'll have to kill me. I laugh, as does he. There's something so funny about sarcasm and irony. I've been starving ever since I left the house, but I don't want to tell him because my dear sister tells me men think only little girls can't control their hunger. Daddy says that's one of the reasons why he doesn't think I'm old enough. But then this gentleman tells me he wants to get something to eat, and he knows just the right place. My dear sister tells me not to trust men who want to take me somewhere I don't know, but he seems like the right person. He takes me by the arm and we head out. He brings me a meal that I can't where he got from, although his thoughtfulness makes me forget why this is a problem. I still feel hungry even after eating. He laughs it off, saying he knew this would happen. He gives me something to drink and says it'll be fine and I'll feel better. My dear sister tells me certain men like to take advantage of impressionable women. Yet, I look at his face and can't help but oblige. We walk along while I start feeling lightheaded. Maybe it's because he's been spinning me around, but I see the world moving on its own too. The man looks amused at my dizziness and holds me close, asking me where I live. I tell him Daddy isn't home and I've got my own room. This makes the man so much happier. He remains a perfect gentleman the whole way through, even happily agreeing to come home with me, saying he wants to make sure I'm okay. My dear sister tells me she's been in similar situations before, but I'm not sure if men accompany her this way or not. We reach home and we go up to my room. I turn around to welcome him like a good host, but he doesn't look like a gentleman anymore. He locks the door behind him, turning around slowly. This time, I don't see any kindness in his face as his eyes squint. Before I can ask what's wrong, he slaps me in the face, grabs me by the shoulders and flings me onto the bed. A grin forms on his mouth as he unclips his belt. He tells me he lied about being a reporter and that he promised himself this wouldn't happen again. He just can't resist seeing an innocent girl. Some would call this a crime, but he can't help it because it feels good to force himself on girls like me. The smile on his face slides off when he sees me laughing. He asks me if I don't understand what he intends to do with me, but I find it funny how innocent he is. After all, I didn't lie when I told him I was still hungry. Daddy didn't think I was old enough, and I'm so happy I proved him wrong. My dear sister never found food when she was my age. I know Daddy will be proud of me. I did control my hunger this far, and I see it now as he moves the secret cupboard aside and enters with a smile. He can be so absent-minded. The knife in his hand is still dripping blood from the last man we had in the house. Looks like he forgot to clean it again. My dear sisters brought so many delicious men over the years, and I was so sure I was ready too. I see it in her face as she enters after Daddy, that look of pride in her face. She let me make the first cut the last time. It's only fair I let her slice this man up to return the favor. My guest looks so funny trying to pull his pants up as his face contorts in horror. I'm usually right, and I can tell he's going to be a screamer. Lucky for him, we love to hear our food shriek before we eat them. It just makes it tastier for some reason. And I really am so hungry. It tends to get messy when we prepare our meal. Too bad this dress might get a little dirty, but maybe the blood stains can be a souvenir from my first night out. After all, I'm a big girl now. The victim was an escaped convict who had sexually assaulted many women before. The family was apprehended years later after many mysterious disturbances were linked to them. The man's remains were found, among others, in the refrigerator kept in the younger daughter's room. In every single one of her pictures, the girl had the same maddening look on her face. And in each one, her eyes were staring deep into my soul, as if she had made her mind to devour it. Those teeth remained so sharp and baring, I could feel them tearing into my throat to drain my blood. She was ghastly, and all I had were these pictures to show for it. But I had to be free of her involvement in my life, so I collected the photos and mailed them. She would leave me alone now that she had what she wanted. The days after that, my ears were vacant of the incessant footsteps that had consumed me. There was freedom at last. I could go out without looking behind my shoulder. The images of the girl's face began ebbing away from my memory, and I treated it as a forgotten nightmare. I woke up with intense dread. It was still dark outside, but I'd been shuddered awake, feeling a throbbing in my body, a twisting vine of fear growing within me. I opened my eyes to see my bedroom door ajar. At the base of the door lay what looked like a parchment. It was a picture of me. The floor was littered with hundreds of copies of these photos. Within each one I saw myself looking back. Me walking in the street. Me looking behind my shoulder with apprehension. Me holding my camera. Me in my dark room. The pictures formed a trail down the stairs. I trembled forward, picking one after another. My face appeared younger the more pictures I found. They were going further back. Before I reached the bottom, I realized the pictures weren't of me anymore. It was of another man. He had a camera in hand. He was walking around the city. He looked terrified of something or someone. There was a feeling of dread etched on his face. The first pictures were from a distance, the later ones were coming closer. Behind a wall, behind his shoulder, by his face, looking down at his unconscious body. I reached my door, which was left open. At the entrance, I found another picture. It made me freeze in terror. The man was bound and gagged. He was strapped to a chair, his hands tied together in front of him. The pictures closed up on his face, focusing on those features for me to understand. Although I'd lost my breath seeing these photos, it wasn't the fact that someone was captive. It wasn't that he was probably in pain. It was because I knew who he was. It was the photographer. I was led outside as the trail continued into the street. The man's face was contorted in agony. He seemed to be in terrible pain. His eyelids were crunched together as his lungs let out what would have been an ear-shattering scream. I finally reached the end of the trail, seeing a lone envelope lying on the middle of the street. Shuddering with every part of my body, I knelt down to find a note inscribed. For you, Roger Dodger. A photographer can fit his skill in just one finger. It was my turn to scream. Inside the envelope was a small plastic bag dripping with blood. I witnessed something flop outside of the bag. A small stump, at the end of which dangled a goop-like substance that bathed the ground in red. The photographer's finger lay bloody and useless nearby as the air was consumed by my never-ending cries of terror. People flooded the scene to find me racked with hysteria. In front of me, I saw what seemed like the girl staring at me once more with those steely, deadly eyes, that orifice-like mouth turning upward to expose those gleaming fangs that most likely tore through that poor man's hand. I pointed at her and bellowed to the people to apprehend her, to understand that she was the one responsible. But it was me who was being held back, getting pinned to the ground as the authorities were called. Ahead, the girl turned her head to and fro, playfully telling me my attempts were futile. Having no evidence against me, the police acquitted me of any wrongdoing. I told them everything about the girl at the wedding, how she had been following me, became obsessed with her pictures. As I found out, the photographer had reported a similar harassment complaint himself, but had been turned away due to lack of evidence. When the police searched my house for evidence, they found my darkroom destroyed. The records of film had been burned. When they searched the address of the girl I'd given them, it turned out someone else lived there. The girl had been stealing their posts. There was no record of her whereabouts. Tragically, they never found the photographer, and he was declared dead in absentia. I've been hounded by conspiracy theorists for years, with the majority having the consensus that the girl was a lunatic who was obsessed with having the perfect picture taken. She could have gone through scores of other people. I happened to be one of her targets. I learned to live with this horror of my past, but I haven't told my story now after so long without cause. Yesterday, I received a letter in the post. Having read what was written, I expect to be declared dead in absentia myself, and want to have proof that should this happen, I didn't disappear, it was her. The letter had only a few words on them. Roger Dodger. The Peking Man. I've always been curious about the Peking Man. He was there when I went to school. The very first day. I remember when my mother had left me at the school steps, and I begged her not to let me go. She had loved me with everything she had, but she still let me go. I remember sitting in the back of the classroom, me, the quiet one, the one who didn't want to talk. Then, I did speak. I had my first friend. She was an angel. An angel descended from the clouds just to keep me company. When I was around her, the world felt light. It felt easy. We laughed, we joked, we became friends. I'd forgotten my loneliness. The hours trickled by in a shower of laughter. I remember the bus halting to a stop when we returned home. We were made to step out in the open road while the driver inspected the vehicle. By the road was an enormous forest we were told not to enter. But she was very curious and took me too. We didn't go deep, but went enough to lose our passage of time. The two of us threw stones in a puddle of water, flung leaves in the air, and chased each other around. She remembered we were supposed to wait by the bus, and we ran back. I was too slow. She was out of my sight. When I got to the road, the bus was gone. I must have cried for hours. My childish mind played terrifying tales of perishing on that road, with no one to ever come for me. And then, I stopped crying. By the corner of my eye, I saw someone. Turning my head around, my eyes met his. His face was peeking by the edge of a tree within the forest. The man had his head tilted to the side playfully. His hair was clean and combed, the eyes like everybody else's, only much whiter than any other I ever seen. I couldn't see the rest of his face. It was as if this man was only made of hair and eyeballs. He did nothing. He just stood there, that head poking by the side of a tree, as those eyes stared deep through me. Terror I'd never experienced raged within my chest. It was fear. A fear that enveloped me completely in those eyes that tore inside my body. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was look back. The man made no movements. His head remained titled. He was just there. I could hear the blaring of horns in the back of my head as the road was met with light from the bus that came to rescue me. But I didn't react. I was still looking at the peeking man. In the back of the van, I asked my friend if she saw him too. As we moved farther and farther away from the woods, the man still peeking toward me. She said yes. She saw him. Only, she couldn't bear to look at him. She told me to stop looking. She was in tears. But I couldn't stop until we finally were too far. She wasn't my friend anymore. Not after that day. It wasn't my fault. The peeking man had been the one to scare her, but she couldn't accept me. My sorrow was great. My parents had to move so I could forget about the peeking man. They never believed me when I told them about him. Years passed, and I slowly moved the peeking man out of my thoughts. It was only my curiosity that remained. I was in college, and my life was improving. I was in a new place, with new people. The campus felt bright and shiny. It was fresh with young minds, and I was happy to be one of them. I was one of the most popular students there. I was even famous among women. They would try to impress me, batting their eyes hoping I'd flash a smile their way, quarreling with one another to be in my company. Life was exciting. It was mine to live. It was another night out at a party, and another time I was being mobbed by a bevy of women. I excused myself to the restroom, where I stood in front of the mirror admiring the handsome face that had formed after years of fear. And then, he returned. He was peeking from the edge of the mirror, perfectly halved by the end of the frame, and from there his head peeked toward me. The same terror filled my bones, and I shuddered with resisted anguish as I saw the change the years had brought in him. The peeking man had a full face now. His skin was white, so much that it seemed as if the whites of his eyes had consumed the rest of his face. His eyes were almost as large as his cheeks, and they flowed with waves that sparkled, yet there were no tears. Once more, he just looked at me. And like before, I couldn't see anything but the face that seemed to protrude from the edge of the mirror. His hair was longer, but stood up straight like the trees in the forest I'd left him so long ago. I'd learned my lesson and tore my eyes away. I believed my parents that he wasn't real. Except he was. My head was bashed into the mirror. I felt the shards piercing my skin, my eyes feeling those agonizing slices of glass penetrating my vision, my face impaled with ferocious, unrepentant pain. I was found by the same people who had admired me, now sporting revolted expressions as they saw the bloody mess that was left of me. I saw many people zoom past as I was carried away, but my blood-soaked eyes couldn't locate the peeking man, the man who had returned with a vengeance. My fame left me for the scars that dominated my face. No more admirers, no more friends. All I had left was my mother. She was the light of my life. The only person willing to look at the scarred monstrosity I was. She made me feel more than nothing. It was in the arms of my mother I finally found acceptance. My mother remained with me through my days in the hospital. She could even get me to laugh when no one could. Then, through the corner of the room, the peeking man returned. I was transfixed as I saw him return with another change in his features. The whiteness in his face had vanished, with his lips nowhere to be seen either. He wore a top hat that had long strands of hair falling from every side onto his blackened face and shoulders. What had me racked with fear were his eyes. They were bloodshot, so very red that the man's pupils seemed like the darkness itself swimming in those bloody pools. I wanted to cry for my mother to see him, to witness the man who had been tormenting me for years in the doorway where his head poked from. However, he left before my mother turned. No one believed me once more, but I was certain he would not leave until he had what he wanted. I buried my mother the next day. Her body was found on the seat she'd slept on beside me. Her eyes closed as if having drifted off into some far-reaching dream. The doctors insisted it was a natural death, but I knew my mother hadn't breathed her last due to fate. My sadness returned, but so did my curiosity. You see, he was now my object of interest. I wanted to see the Peking man again, to know really who he was. But I found her again, that thing called happiness. She arrived in the form of the woman who would become my wife. She found me lost and confused. She didn't mind the scars, she only wanted the person inside me. I could never find any faults in my wife. She was a healer, a person who came into my life to mend the shattered pieces I couldn't pick up. I'd been cursed all these years just so I could be blessed. Even then, I would look out the corners of my eyes for any sign of the Peking man. During those walks late at night where my wife held onto my arm laughing, or when she looked deep into my face with love, I would search for him in the shadows. But I never did see him. I suppose, in the end, it was my curiosity that would never let me go. Because now, as I look into the face of my wife, bloody, decrepit, and in shock, I still feel that churning curiosity in my stomach. She would still be beautiful, had her eyes not been opened in such horror. A horror I now recall I'd seen before in the faces of the women in my past. My hand holds up the jagged shard that I extracted deep from within my wife's heart, the blood there dry due to the time I've been staring at it. I also see the floor decorated by several thousands of pieces of glass, as my feet stand bare and rancid among them. As the blackness of my mind fades, I recall the moment I'd seen the glass break and the warm blood spilling out of my wife as the room filled with her tortured shrieks. Upon instinct, I look back and see him again. The Peking man pokes from behind the wall. His hair dilapidated, as if all the insanity had trickled down his head. His eyes a mixture of that hellish red and blinding white, his mouth seemed torn in places, as I see several holes on his face that are marred with blood. What has me curious isn't seeing the Peking man again. It's that he doesn't seem so far anymore. The more I look at him, the closer I get. And now, I don't see the Peking man. I see a man crouched on the floor with a woman in his arms as my head stretches out from the corner of the wall. He looks back at me, a face that I used to see in the mirror once before. So, if he's over there, then who am I? To my corner, I see another mirror and the person peeking back. The same man who's always been there. The man who had first been seen by my friend in the woods. I used to be curious of the Peking man. I'm not curious anymore.